Just keep you updated as the day goes. So we have Gene Spafford, professor. Are you professor emeritus or ultra professor? Or professor at Purdue University. You know, people talk about that guy wrote the book on this, and this guy did. Multiple books. Very well known and respected leader in the community for many, many years. Thousands of students benefited from his instruction. So I'd like to welcome up Dr. Spafford to talk about myths and misconceptions in cybersecurity, and I'll put in a plug that we have books at Merch, which opens at 11. So if you want to buy one of his books, we've got them out there, and I bet he would even sign it for you. All right, let's give a round of applause to Dr. Spafford.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Let me just say, as someone who's been involved in running various kinds of events, running University Center for many decades, it is often unseen how much effort and dedication and talent is required to keep something going. And we should all be very thankful that John has decided to devote his energies to keeping CornCon not only going, but growing. And we're all very fortunate to have this kind of event and this kind of person. So thank you, John. I'm going to talk about some myths and misconceptions. That this is the topic of the recent book. If you heard my talk at CornCon 5 years ago, you heard the beginnings of this. I was at that time talking about some of the concepts that found their way into the book. And the book has 175 common myths and misconceptions that are present in cybersecurity. If the publisher decides to do a second edition, we have enough to put it over 200. And these are not things I'm going to tell you to help you run an enterprise, to manage your security. These are issues to think about. Are you focusing on the right things? Have you got some of the wrong ideas? Or often, how do you talk to management to make them aware that they're focusing on the wrong things? So I've picked out a few things about cybersecurity, 5 myths really that I'm going to focus on here. And I'm going to start by saying something about cybersecurity itself. If we talk about doing cybersecurity, what does that really mean? What is it as a field? Well, if we look at how a field is formally defined, and I'm an academic, and this is one of the things that I do, a field can be defined if it has a distinct history that is separate from other fields, if it has some accepted body of knowledge that people refer to, usually published, but otherwise it can be things that everybody knows about, some generally accepted references and standards, could be government standards, industry standards, but things that we all measure by, some common terminology. When we don't have a solid enough formal foundation, we end up using myths, using statements to fill the void. We're seeing right now, actually, in parts of the US, where because internet is cut off, news is cut off during the tragedy of Hurricane Helene, people are circulating all kinds of terrible rumors that are false, but they're taking hold in part because people are trying to fill the void of information, and they're amplifying some of their fears and some of their biases. Well, that's what happens when we don't have some of these good sources and common knowledge. Cybersecurity as a field isn't really new. It goes back, well, one of the first published reports, for any of you who are interested in looking, 1967, the WARE report that was done for the Air Force by the RAND Corporation, outlined a lot of the problems in cybersecurity that we still have today. It actually goes back even further. Project Mac started at MIT in 1963, that led to Multics, that led to Unix, that led to other things. But it's in some senses not new, in other senses very new. If we compare this, for instance, with the field of medicine or civil engineering, mechanical engineering, it's very young. Those are fields that have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And they've learned a lot. They've built up a lot of reference material and experience. We're still doing it. The Anderson report was a follow-on to the Ware report, if you're interested in looking at these things. The two of those together then eventually prompted the development of the Trusted Systems Evaluation Criteria, the Orange Book, if you've heard of that. So we had an initial start here primarily focused on Department of Defense needs, on mainframe computers, which is another aspect of the evolution that I don't have time to really go into. But if we're going back here, that's not that long ago, right? We're looking 50 years, approximately. 50 years ago, it was mainframes. There were no networks, no internet, no cell phones, no apps, no tablets, no IoT, none of those things. It was an environment of big mainframe systems for data processing. In 50 years, which is about almost 2 human generations as they're calculated by sociologists, we have had this incredible transformation where we've gone from a few hundred mainframes to the point where there are approximately 3 computers per person alive on the earth today. That's an incredible transformation as a field. Now, that gives us some history. How about the standards, the common information? Well, we have some standards. In fact, we've got a lot of standards, and they don't necessarily all align with each other. So we have several versions of a common body of knowledge that have been put forth by various organizations. We have various certifications, and I list a couple here, like the CISSP and the A+, and the UK's CyBOC. So we have different ways of measuring what knowledge people have. We have standards for practice and personnel and evaluation. NIST has a whole lot, including the Cybersecurity Framework and the NICE standards. ISACA, ISC Squared, BSA, ISO, a lot of these organizations have put forward a variety of standards. If you work in security, you're familiar with several of them, or should be. We do have some standard reference books that have come out that are commonly accepted. So for instance, Bishop's books, Flieger's books, Bellavin, Anderson, Stallings. So there are some reference books that are out there that talk about elements of the field. And we certainly have some common terms of art, some particular words that mean something in our field, like virus means something very different from what biologists or epidemiologists view as viruses. Ransomware is a particular term within our field. It doesn't exist outside. It's really, people know it, but it is from our field. ROP-oriented, right, return-oriented programming, again, is not something that even in software engineering, compiler writing, it's a term unique to cybersecurity. So we have a number of these things that actually match the definition. All right, so given that we have some of the foundation for the field of cybersecurity, let me talk about these myths. And the first one is the myth that we have a clear definition of what cybersecurity is. And that's wrong. There's a whole chapter of the book that's devoted to this. And let me start and give you just a sort of a hand-waving kind of description of this. If we start with an intuitive definition, that a system is secure if it's protected against all forms of threat. Okay, that seems like a reasonable first definition. If we're going to secure a computer, we want to protect it against threats. All right. So can we do that? Let's give that some thought. If we apply best practices and tools that we know how to, we can probably keep out most random hackers. Okay. Can we keep out most malware? Probably. It gets a little more difficult as the enterprise gets larger and we look at sophisticated ransomware. And if you are targeted by some foreign governments, odds are you won't be successful, but we can probably keep that out. Because those nation-state hackers have a lot of resources and time, more so than most of us have, or really any of us individually have. So, yeah, we're not going to be able to secure against that. UFO invasion? Nope, I don't think so. Assuming we have them, right? Unless we have Jeff Goldblum on our side, we're probably out of luck. How about an extinction level meteor impact? Can you secure your systems against that? If so, talk to me after the session here, because I'd like to hear about it. But that's not something that we can protect against. So can we protect our system against all threats? Well, we're beginning to come up empty here. Okay, so maybe if we listen to Elon Musk, which I would suggest is not a good idea, but let's say that we did that and we decided to have colonies on Mars so we had backups for our materials. Would that help against a meteor impact or an alien invasion? Well, no, because eventually the heat death of the sun, it will expand into a red giant that will consume out through the orbit of Mars, and that I'm unaware of any media that could survive that. So eventually that's going to be a problem. Now, just so you don't have to rush out after and miss any of the remaining part of CornCon, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So you can not worry about that. But I know you're thinking, aha, you know, we'll just go beyond the orbit of Mars, and no, physicists predict the eventual heat death of the universe, at which point we can't do anything. So in a certain time scale, and by the way, these are not all the potential threats, at a certain time scale and magnitude of threat, no, we cannot protect our system against all threats. So a system can't be secure, at least according to that definition. And that's the way it works, because if we think about how cybersecurity really works, we are attempting to balance risk with opportunity with cost. We will spend a certain amount of money to protect against a certain level of risk, but we can't spend infinite money because we don't have it. And at a certain point, we've got to say it's good enough because we have to balance against the investment for new opportunities as well. So this actually highlights the fact that security is really fundamentally an economics issue. It's a risk balancing issue. It's not really a technology issue. But maybe we have to adjust our definition accordingly. All right, well, another one that's been tried is to look at the idea of let's try to come up with a little more formal definition of risk, and can we maybe bound cybersecurity using a definition of building it? Well, this started in the 70s, so it goes back a long time where people have been looking at this, that if we define a system as having allowed states, and those are things that we're allowing the system to do, and we're going to say that the system is operating properly in those circumstances. And as long as, whenever the system changes state, that is, there's an execution involved of instructions, as long as it's still within those allowed states, it's good. And that can be something depending on a policy. And if you've delved into the policies like Bell-LaPadula or BIBA or some of the other policies. If you don't know what those are, don't worry about it. It's not critical for this. But there is the idea that there is a policy as to say what kinds of things are allowed. You set policies within your organizations about what's allowed. Now, there are bad states by implication. If the system is in a certain state, things aren't good. We don't want it to get to those places. Right? So as long as the execution stays in those good states, all's fine. Right? Think about a bad state being executed as having a user process suddenly take on administrator privileges. That's an execution path we don't want to happen, except through very carefully defined circumstances. So this matches with what software engineering has been doing for quite a while. The idea of system specification and allowed states, the idea of faults, failures, and so on. And cybersecurity was one of the drivers of software engineering. The problem is that the way most systems are developed, we have undefined states. The system can get into states and we don't know if they're good or bad because it really is more what happens next. That it could be where it is okay, it's doing something we didn't think about, but maybe it's okay, and we don't know. If it goes from there into a bad state, a disallowed state, well, that's a fault, that's a problem. And as I note here, if we go back into a good state from that undefined state, all right, we can allow that. But this is what it really probably looks like. That most software that you get has huge undefined, unknown states. And those are undefined and unknown by the people who wrote them. You don't know what they are because you're buying their design. Have you ever seen a specification for Microsoft Excel or Word or Oracle database? Do you know what states are allowed and not? Do those match your internal policies? How do you know if those actually meet your definitions of policy to be able to even try to map something like this? So the conclusion here is really that most of the software that we're using operates in undefined states. We don't know. That some of that software has never actually even been specified. And a system that hasn't been specified according to policy can never be wrong. It can only be surprising. That's where we are, surprised on a regular basis, as the software does things that we didn't expect because we didn't know how it was designed and provided to us. Sometimes when we report that to the vendors, their response is, oh, you're using it wrong, that's not a bug. That's not helpful. That doesn't help us in getting to a secure set of software. The problem is that formal specification is time-consuming and expensive. Programmers don't like to do it. Programmers don't like to verify software in any way, whether it's formally or not. We cite one study that was done that people who work with open source software, only 3% were willing to do security audits of software that was already out there. That should not make you feel good about using open source software. It's not being audited by other people. That idea that many eyes make bugs shallow is wishful thinking, because people are much more interested in writing their own new driver for something and putting it into a repository, their own new tool, than they are to go back and look at what others have done to see if it is working properly. And of course, a lot of what we do is built to very general requirements. And the requirements are those of the vendors rather than the consumers. The vendors are guessing at what we want, what policies we're going to implement, what specifications, and they're supplying products to a mass marketplace with the assumption that if enough people buy it, that's a success and that must be what we want. And in some cases, because that's all we have, that's kind of what we want. Several years ago, and this goes back several years, but I think the audience old enough to remember, how many of us wanted software that would randomly cause us to sit and stare at a blue screen for 5 minutes? That's what we got. That's what we bought. We didn't complain enough about it. We didn't switch to other vendors. How many of you, after your third or fourth blue screen, were sitting there and going, well, this is outrageous, I'm going to switch to Apple? A couple of you, but certainly not the majority. It's that kind of thing that we're accepting the stuff that they're giving us that's designed to make them money. It is not designed necessarily to help us do our jobs on a regular basis. So here's that quote that I mentioned earlier, that a program that hasn't been specified is not incorrect, it can only be surprising, and we just deal with surprises on a regular basis. And that's basically how vendors provide their software. So what's the point of this myth? Well, we don't have a clear definition of security. We really don't have a clear definition. You can find things in books. And NIST, for instance, has a couple definitions. In fact, NIST has 3 definitions. For a standards organization to have 3 separate definitions of the same thing suggests there's a problem. But there's more. You can find lots of them. And even our term of what it is we're trying to build, is it a trusted system? Are we managing risk? Is it trustworthy? Is it resilient? What is security? We don't know. We do not have a commonly accepted definition across the industry that academia, government, industry all use. Part of that leads to the problem is we don't have metrics. I cannot sell you a system that has 2 more units of security than the one you have, because I have no way of measuring that. Even if I knew what it was, I can't measure it. And that hurts us, because we can buy things, we can measure in dollars the cost, we can measure in watts the power consumption, we can measure in milliflops, megaflops, whatever we want for speed of processing, or megabytes or terabytes, or we've got measurements for lots of things, but not for security. So we're stuck with these myths and these misconceptions. Having good metrics and having a definition allows us to drive towards satisfying it, towards building systems that improve over previous ones. We don't have that. And that's part of the problem with the field. In part, it's because it's young. I had a conversation many years ago with Harlan Mills, and he said that at the point in software development where we are now, because it's a young field, is where civil engineering was before they invented the right triangle. And if you think about it, that's probably not too far off. Civil engineering's been around for a long time and built a lot of bridges and buildings that fell down before they developed some of the principles they have now. That doesn't excuse some of what we're getting, but it does help explain it. So part of that as well is, how do we relate security to safety, to resiliency, to reliability? We don't know, because we can't really measure it. Second myth is more technology is better. We do not value simplicity. We are attracted to new, bright, shiny objects. And in fact, we continue to deploy new things because we want to support legacy, we want to support the old thing, but then we got to build new things on top and find a way to do it. So we're stuck in this loop of trying to fix broken old things by adding new things that then break, and we've got to add new things. And we have to have faster technology and more capability to continue to support the old things. Your version of Windows supports anything that was written for Windows going back into like Windows 95, if not before, and it's got DOS built in. That's because customers might leave if they didn't have the compatibility issues. That's a fundamental problem. It keeps us from trying new architectures, new approaches, new ways of looking at how to secure our systems because we're constantly trying to patch the old ones. It results in this kind of mess. So in the upper left, you know, that's kind of a standard Wenger's Swiss Army knife. It's got a few tools on it that are nice. You can actually buy the one on the right. I have one on my shelf. It's expensive, but you look at that, my gosh, there is a tool for almost everything there. At one point, I started thinking through, theoretically, you could build a house with that thing on the right. You'd swear a lot. It would take you a long time, and it probably wouldn't be very good, but it has all the tool capability that you need to do that. But that would be ridiculous. You would want to have tools that were fit for purpose, that were designed to do things well, not everything mediocre, but do some things well. Why don't we do that with our cyber infrastructure? Why do we use the same 2, 3 operating systems for everything? From business data processing to real-time control to IoT to running dishwashers to running our spreadsheets. Why are we using the same thing? Why do we use the same spreadsheet model for every financial and numerical and scientific calculation? Why aren't we better at building tools for purpose that have fewer things to fail and that might cause us to swear less? That's a problem that we have as a field, again, because we are accepting what we're given rather than asking the question of what is it we really need. All that complexity leads to what are known as emergent failures, failures that we haven't been able to predict. It turns out that when you add more software, the faults multiply. They don't add. It is the product of the number of lines of code, the number of features that suggests the number of faults, not the sum. Once we pass a certain size, we have no capability of understanding the modes of failure. And this is where emergent failures come in, where things break and unexpected ways and unexpected places. And we've already seen some cases where this kind of happens. I think the CrowdStrike outage is a really good example of that kind of failure where one thing fails and then there's this cascade of other effects that weren't predicted, weren't anticipated, and were difficult to recover from. And it could get worse because we don't understand this. When I graduated with my PhD originally from Georgia Tech, I could teach any course in the CS curriculum. If you wanted to sit down with me, I could tell you how a computer worked from the circuit level to the user interface. There is no person alive who can do that now for a modern system. They are too complex. We have just added so much. We have computers that run multiple systems. Those multiple systems interact in a network, and then beyond that with cloud servers. The cloud servers have containers. The containers are running virtualized systems. The virtualized systems have their own containers. For many of us, we have absolutely no idea what is within our reach and how things actually work in the large because of all the complexity. And that is what is going to really bring us down, is there going to be some little failure somewhere along the way and everything will just cascade, fall apart. Oh. So how do we approach that? We decide we're going to put more technology in place. We're going to have yet new tools, new layers, new something that we're going to add on top because, gosh, we love technology. Give us that bright, shiny thing. Sell it to us. Now, it's a specialized field in security, And you look at some of the kinds of things we worry about. We worry about attackers. We worry about malware. We need intrusion detection. We need firewalls. We have network traffic to monitor. So what do? We buy new technology for each of these things. According to some studies that we've seen from Forrester, the average large enterprise has over 50 different security tools to manage everything that's going on. 50 different tools. And then you've got to have tools on top of those tools to manage and correlate all the log files. And then you have to have a staff and a network operations center to keep track of all of those reports. And then you've got to have auditors to make sure, well, it is a huge enterprise to manage all that complexity, all of that technology. Bob Courtney, who was one of the pioneers in the field, said there are no technical solutions to management problems, but there are management problems to technical solutions. And by management, it means not only just business management, but also issues of law and social order, if you want to take that into a larger context, that we don't employ. In fact, many of our people who are involved in the cyber arena aren't really good at interacting with others. Present company excluded, of course. But as a result, instead of setting a policy to tell people no, we would much rather spend time to write a new program that prevents them from even considering it. Instead of thinking through how we can support better usage and involve our users, we move towards new technology. That's part of the problem because we're adding to the technology overload. We're adding to the complexity. But we have to remember, really, fundamentally, people are part of the system. That's one of the reasons we build the systems, is to enable people to do things. Technology is not a goal in itself. It is an enabler of human enterprise and human aspiration. When we design things, we should be designing for the general public rather than our peers. The stories that are out there about how users misuse systems, it used to be in vogue 10 years ago, and I'm glad it's gone away. The idea of stupid user stories was making fun of people who were trying to do their work and couldn't figure out how to make the technology work. And that was amusing to some people. It was really an indictment of our field, that we aren't building things for those people. When I mentioned right now that of the 6.8 billion people on the planet, we have something like 20 billion computing devices, which is an interesting ratio. But also of that 6.8 billion, about 2.5 billion are not literate. That means they're using computer systems, but they're not able to read and write. How many of the things that we use and design for security and privacy are going to be understandable to those people? No wonder they're at a disadvantage. And when things go wrong, what do? We blame the user, right? We say the user is the weakest link, which is not the case. We have made users somewhat at a disadvantage and unreliable because we haven't built the systems and educated them as how best to use them. Users could be part of the strength of our systems if we educated them and gave them the tools, because they're the ones who are seeing the things happening. Right? Things like phishing or ransomware. Instead of treating our users as the enemy, if we treated them as part of the IDS system, if they report things, they clicked on something. Well, if you punish them, if you lecture them because they clicked on something, which is bound to happen at some point, what's going to happen? The average person is going to stop reporting it. They're no longer going to be part of the security solution. They will be an increasing part of the security problem. This is an element that runs through a lot of what we do with software design and security. We have to change our attitude about the role of people in using our technology. They can be part of the solution if we do. And think about, in terms of population, we want, if we're going to enable everyone to be able to use systems securely and have privacy, when we say everyone, how about people with physical limitations? People who have poor vision. Motor coordination, using a mouse, is not a simple thing. Something as simple as color blindness. I know somebody who had problems at a network operations center because they could not tell the difference in color that was popping up on the screen for warnings. Otherwise very talented, but the system hadn't been designed with that kind of limitation in mind. And as I begin to age a little bit, I'm noticing, yeah, my vision isn't as crisp, my memory isn't quite as good, and there are some systems that depend on that I simply don't have. Different biometric profiles. For instance, if we're going to go to facial recognition, we better be sure that people with different color skin and different hairstyles, different facial features are all equally recognized, or else we're putting some people at a disadvantage. All of these kinds of issues are normally ignored by many developers because the customers don't ask for them and because they're designing for people like them. That's another part of the security problem, because the people like them know how the system works, maybe know what some of the considerations are. If we're going to be successful at better security, we have to make everybody part of the system. That means a change in attitude. Yeah, patching is not part of security. That may be a surprise to some of you, but it is one of the myths. It really isn't security. Building it the first time is security. Patching it after the fact is fixing where we screwed up, that we didn't get it right the first time. Especially if you look at some of the things that are patched, those are errors that we've been teaching for 50 years not to make in the code, and we're still getting buffer overflows. We're still getting out of bounds errors. Patching after a security incident did not prevent the incident. It doesn't help with recovery of the incident. It's not security. It's damage control. We spend too much of our time patching because we're buying lousy software. We are not acting as system administrators, we are system janitors. And we are cleaning up after the mess made by the people who are producing the rotten software. But we don't demand that correct code. And we don't have the metrics to be able to tell if we're getting it. Remember I said patching adds complexity? There's a physical analog. See that sign, do not touch any of these wires? The story that I had associated with this picture is that someone came in and tried to clean it up by moving some of the wires and bundling them together, and the system stopped working, and they didn't know why. So they had to go back to this. I'm sure you've probably seen other situations like this. But patching isn't security. Patching is fixing carelessness, is fixing a mistake. It's after the fact. I had a conversation with Richard Donzik, who was a former Secretary of the Navy, and he had a very interesting way of looking at this. He said that we're currently in the standpoint of looking at computing sort of the Ptolemaic way. Ptolemy was the ancient philosopher who described the heavens with everything circling around the Earth. Right? So that was the Earth-centric view of the solar system and the universe, which we know isn't correct. But that was his description. And many years later, Copernicus came up with his view. Well, in the Ptolemaic view, we had to make patches. So you've heard about Mercury retrograde, for instance. If in fact, Mercury was circling around the Earth and you're observing it in the night sky, you will see occasionally that it goes backwards and then goes forwards again, because that's the way its orbit is. And Venus will do the same thing, because those are inner planets around the sun. But if you believe that they're going around the Earth, you have to come up with patches to the model as you observe these things to make it work for the astrologers. When Copernicus came out with his view, it simplified everything and explained all those anomalies. But people rejected it because it didn't match what they were doing, particularly the astrologers, because it didn't match what they were doing and selling as their services as astrologers. And it actually got to the point where some of Copernicus's followers were put to death. It was that controversial. But it's a much better system. It explains things and it's correct. We need to make that transition to how we use computers, but there's a lot of resistance. The people who are currently really enamored of the current technology are the astrologers, and they don't want to have their business impacted by going to a system that's simpler and has a different approach. All right, that's driven by this misconception that speed and cost are most important, because that's what we can measure. I think for most enterprises, probably yours as well, if we had a good set of metrics for security and privacy, you might be buying products based on that, even if the product was slower or cost a little more, because you'd be able to make the decision as to how much to spend to get the better security. But ask yourself, why is time to market more important than quality? Why is it that we're more interested in early adoption than we are in getting it right? Why is something fast more important than safe? Would you prefer a car that can go 20 miles an hour faster, but is more likely to blow up if you hit a speed bump? That's what we do with software. Why do we value speed over safety? And why is patching more important than good design? And I would say this goes again back to the definitions. We don't have good metrics. We don't know what it is to have good security. And as a result, we don't get it. So I'm going to sum up here by saying these are not suggestions for how you can change how you do things in the enterprise necessarily, but they are part of a conversation we should all be having about what is important. What is the current conventional wisdom? What is it we are accepting on a regular basis? We just buy it, we get it from vendors, we put it in place, and we don't ask ourselves, does this make sense? Is this how we should be doing things? Can we do better? Can we seek simplicity to make things easier to manage and less likely to break? Can we include, as part of our whole system, the people involved rather than simply the technology? We start thinking about what we do for training, education, rewards, awareness, rather than simply putting items on a desktop or on an app. And promoting the good values that come out of that. Rather than penalizing people for asking questions, actually rewarding people for coming up with suggestions about how to change that whole enterprise. If you're interested in the thinking behind this, there's the book. I'll be happy to sign copies here. I'm going to be here for several hours today, and then again, I have to leave a little bit in the afternoon, but I'll be back in the evening. My wife, who illustrated the book, is also here. She's currently upstairs working with the kids. She will also be willing to sign, should you wish. She did the cover. She's a very talented artist. And I would challenge all of you who care about the field to start thinking about the future. I'll say one more thing here. I realize I'm right close to the end. 50 years ago, we were concerned with mainframes. We were working in COBOL, Fortran, assembler. That was our world. In 50 years, we have changed the world so that every person on Earth has the potential to be connected to every other one through computing. We generate zettabytes of information per year. We have more computers than people. 50 years, the changes we have brought. Okay. What is the world going to look like 50 years from now? That rate of change, other than adoption, I mean, we're not going to suddenly have a whole new population of people, unless those aliens do invade. But the computing technology and software, the advances that we're making in data and AI and other systems, are going to continue at a very fast pace. All of us are in a position to influence where that's going over the next 50 years. Do you want the future, for whoever you care about in the future, including perhaps ourselves, to be a Star Trek future or a Blade Runner future? That's up to all of us to have a part. And I'll leave you with that thought. Do we have time for questions? We have time for questions. I'd be happy to respond or talk to you offline afterwards. Thank you very much. I guess if you have a question, let the gentleman here know with a mic. No questions. Well, that makes it very easy to answer them. Thank you again. Enjoy the rest of CornCon.